Hi everyone. Today I'll be talking about Japan's oldest decorative paper, currently called Uchigumo Gami. I'll be covering history and technique, and will discuss briefly how this relatively obscure paper type could relate to our practice today. So, what is Uchigumo Gami? Uchi means to hit, and kumo means cloud, and kami means paper. So this might today be called, in English, hit cloud paper, although you should know that these characters and these meanings have changed over time. Another name for Uchigumo Gami is simply kumogami, or cloud paper. As you can see in the example here, the design is meant to look like clouds floating on the surface of a piece of paper. These clouds are achieved through multiple dips into different vats in a sort of dance at the dyed pulp vat. This is why, instead of calling this hit cloud paper, I like to think of Uchigumo as a choreography of clouds. Here is a contemporary example of Uchigumo paper. The top clouds are made of indigo dyed matter, while the bottom clouds are made of a combination of indigo and safflower. I will talk a bit more about these color choices later, but contemporary explanations say that blue is the sky and purple is land. As we will see though, history and religious studies have revealed this is far more complicated. Uchigumo paper dates from the Heian period, which is 794 to 1185 CE. The paper was loved by poets who sought to frame their prose with the heavens. The paper was particularly popular for tanka, poems that are slightly longer than haiku and that speak of romance in the seasons. Here you can see one anthology of tanka on a scroll in which the maker has tried to paste the Uchigumo paper together to make seamless transitions between the pages. This particular example is from the 13th century, and as we can see here, many of these anthologies had both blue and purple editions or sides. While there were no hard rules, blue cloud paper, or aigumo, was typically for poetry about spring, summer, and romance, while purple cloud paper, or murasaki gumo, was for poetry about autumn, winter, longing, and grieving. In this excerpt, called the Chikugo Gire, the calligrapher, Emperor Fushimi from the 13th century, copied a poem that reads, "I changed into my new summer kimono, which I had made of the thin silk cloth like the wings of a cicada, even though I did not hear the buzz of the cicada yet. Purple clouds are in the background, since this poem reflects a longing for summer and tense anticipation for its arrival." However, purple clouds did not appear until the Kamakura period, which was 1185 to 1333 CE. And for centuries, unlike contemporary Uchigumo, the colors never appeared on the same sheet of paper, always on different sheets of paper. So, why would purple clouds be representative of death or grief? This is an image of Daigo, which is the procession in which the Amida Buddha of Japanese Buddhism guides a soul to the Pure Land after death. In literature, the Amida Buddha travels on purple clouds, which you can see in this image. This is one reason why purple clouds came to be associated with mourning for the dead, and sutras for the deceased would be written on purple cloud paper during funerals. To move forward to contemporary Uchigumo paper, we need to talk about the Iwano family in Echizen. The Iwano family has, for 4 generations, made Uchigumo paper, the techniques having come into the family through marriage when Iwano Heizaburo I married into the Nishino family in the 1800s. The head of the Nishino family taught Iwano Heizaburo I how to make Uchigumo paper. This is the Echizen papermaking area, which is in Fukui Prefecture, Japan. It is here that we can find the Heizaburo paper mill. This area has dozens of paper mills working to make a variety of papers. Many of the homes you see here are also paper mills. There is a verse from the traditional Echizen papermaking song that says, "Born in Goka, I and everyone around me learn how to make paper." And in this case, Goka is the 5 villages that comprise the papermaking region. This is Iwano Makiko, who is the 4th generation of this family. So she is Iwano Heizaburo III's daughter. She still makes Uchigumo paper using many of the same techniques and tools that have been used for centuries, although she does so rarely. Just a quick note that in Japan, craftspeople often take the name of their predecessor. That is why there were 3 Iwano Heizaburo before Makiko here. Makiko, however, understandably chose to keep her name. The Heizaburo paper mill is most well known today for its large-scale Japanese painting papers, which you can see a group of craftspeople kuching here. And here we have Makiko's father, Iwano Heizaburo III, making Uchigumo paper. Uchigumo is thus today a piece of family heritage as much as it is a cultural one. This man's grandfather, Iwano Heizaburo I, had a lot of difficulty making paper when he first started out. A few years later, he was making 400 sheets of Uchigumo paper every day. This may be a good time to mention about papermakers. We sometimes cry, but that's work. This is an interpretation of another verse from the Echizen papermaking song. There is sometimes a misconception that kumogami or uchigumogami is only found in Echizen. Until his retirement in 2017, though, Takenobu Tanino sometimes made Uchigumo paper, although his paper was more similar to classical Uchigumo designs. Here he is working at his studio in 2016, 1 year before retirement. He was well known for sitting while making paper and mixing local clay into his slurry. This is his Uchigumo paper. He added local clay to the base sheet, which gives it a smooth opacity. Note that only indigo is used, and how different the designs are compared to the humps of Iwano Uchigumo paper. Moving forward, I will explain a bit how Uchigumo paper is made, and will do so with narration here as well as pre-recorded videos in my studio. The first thing we need to be aware of is that Uchigumo paper is made up of several layers and dips into vats. The first layer is the base paper, which is made of 100% Japanese gampi, a paper otherwise called torinoko gami, which means child of a bird paper, as the paper's surface and color are similar to that of an eggshell. Japanese gampi, or Diplomorpha sikokiana, is harvested in the wild. In Echizen, the Torinoko Preservation Society conducts such harvesting expeditions annually and seeks to preserve 100% Japanese gampi Torinoko paper. You can see some of the gampi fiber hanging here outside of the public papermaking museum after we went into the mountains to harvest it. Getting a bit technical now. What do you need for the base paper? Well, you will need gampi, preferably Japanese gampi, which, as I mentioned, is harvested in the wild and quite rare. So some acceptable but not perfect substitutes are salago, or Philippine gampi, and mizutama. In fact, today, because Japanese gampi is so rare, base paper pulp often contains around 20% mizutama fiber. Gampi types and mizutama are all part of the Thymelaceae family, so generally share similar properties in that they create a lustrous, glossy surface. Abaca can also work as a cheap alternative, but care must be taken to not overbeat the fiber. You also need a Japanese papermaking setup. However, you do not need a suspension system as you might see in paper mills in Japan. You do need a sugeta, which is a deep frame with a removable bamboo screen, which also has a sha, or a mesh covering, attached. And then, of course, you need a vat, clean water, and neti, which disperses the fibers evenly in the vat and slows drainage, allowing you to build layers to create a single sheet. This is sometimes called formation aid. I also won't go over fiber prep in detail, as this info can be found in dozens of other places, but very generally you need to scrape your fiber, cook it, clean it, and beat it by hand. Here is a video showing the movements of Nagashizuki, or traditional multi-layered sheet formation. In this video, I am specifically making Uchigumo base paper from Japanese gampi. You may wonder why so many dips are required and why I move at this speed. For this smooth gampi paper, the idea is to gradually build up layers to make a thicker than usual sheet that is tightly woven and dense. Carefully observe this choreography. Right now I'm moving back and forth, but as this sheet is made, I will also move side to side and in circles in order to tightly weave the fibers together to create a base for subsequent layers of dyed pulp. This also prevents a grain from forming in the paper. If there's a grain in the paper, later dye layers added to this base paper will want to follow the grain, and this could limit design options. Notice as well that there's no suspension system being used. And you'll see the reason for this, but it enables a lot of control when I add the dye layers later. So let's go back to analyzing Uchigumo paper before we jump into the colors and dye layers. I want to discuss the differences between fibers used historically and those used today. Both classical and contemporary Uchigumo paper have a gampi base layer, yet classical Uchigumo paper used kozo fibers for the clouds, while contemporary Uchigumo paper uses gampi for the clouds. You can see the difference here. Kozo fibers are longer and evoke a more ethereal sky on the base paper. The gampi fibers are shorter and allow for a tighter gradient moving from the top of the clouds to the decal. You can see on the right with contemporary Uchigumo, the clouds are evenly spaced, reflecting this rhythm. In contemporary Uchigumo papermaking, the su is also fitted with thicker threads, enabling pulp to travel between these zones with relative consistency. The su, by the way, is the bamboo screen. In addition to a dance, I also like to think of Uchigumo designs as sound waves, as the movement of the clouds reflects the rhythm in which the papermaker moved. or the percussive quality of the process. Furthermore, in classical Uchigumo, the papermaker waited for longer periods of time between forming the base paper and forming the subsequent die layers, whereas in contemporary Uchigumo papermaking, the cloud layers are formed soon after the base sheet. When done in this way, the dyed pulp slides with ease along the wet base paper surface. Classically, however, the base paper dries for more time, and thus the clouds do not leap towards the center, but meander as the dyed pulp encounters more resistance from a partially dried base sheet. You can see that in this example on the left. And there's a detail of that. I want to show you now Iwano Heizaburo III, Makiko's father, forming die layers atop his base layer. The base layer is first made, then slightly dried, and then put back into the frame and dipped into new vats to form the cloud layers. Notice how he dances with his upper body, moving his shoulders and head back and forth as he ensures the clouds reach from the bottom of the sheet towards the middle. We can also see that he is only dipping the lip of the frame into the dye vat layers. This is to ensure that only a little bit of slurry is gathered. Let's see that again. Just a little bit of slurry is gathered. So if you charge it with too much slurry, it'll run across the whole surface area of the base paper. Here we can see a wet sheet versus a dry sheet and can clearly see the different layers. The example here contains 5 total layers, a base paper, 2 blue layers, and 2 purple layers. Let's dive deeper into color. I will show some videos about how color is processed, and we'll talk about historical samples. Here in the background is another sheet of paper by Iwano Heizaburo III. The first thing to note about the colors of Uchigumo Gami is that they are made from what is called hana. In this case, hana is dip-dyed sheets of kozo or gampi, which are then reconstituted into pulp. So instead of dyeing pulp and using that to make paper, these sheets are made, then dip-dyed, dried, and then turned back into pulp. To do this, the hana is gathered into a thick wad with 5 to 6 sheets. For blue, these sheets would be only indigo dyed. For purple, each alternating sheet would be dyed with safflower, so a red-blue combination. And once gathered, the sheets are hit on a stone with a heavy hammer, about 1,000 grams in weight, which compresses the fibers of the wad, turning them into a single, flattened, thicker sheet of paper. This has a few purposes. 1, the pounding slightly clumps fibers in certain spots, which enables granules to form in the pulp. And this is a desirable characteristic of Uchigumo paper. The dyed pulp is sandy and thus appears more like a fog or cloud. 2nd, these particles of pulp become burnished under this pressure, but only in spots, so there is variability in the consistency of the pulp, which in turn creates a desirable surface feel. 3rd, the compressing of the fibers provides more wet strength to the hana, allowing it to be completely soaked with water and repurposed into pulp with minimal loss of pulp. No pulp will get lost in the water, and when beating the paper into pulp again, pulp does not scatter all over the place. So here you can see the wad of hana papers on the left, previously dip-dyed and now gathered together. You can also see a sturdy stone, in this case made from granite. It is important to find a smooth stone or to create a smooth surface yourself. I was able to smooth out this stone using a masonry wheel. If the stone is not smooth on the top and with a sturdy base, the hana will get small tears and cracks, and the stone is also more likely to shatter. Here is a photo of the hana wad being dry pounded on a stone. Note the glossy, burnished surface formed on one corner where I've already pounded the hana. This is a video of the beginning of the hana pounding. Note the fibers becoming compressed, appearing burnished as I move. This will be done for some time, 1 to 2 hours, until the hana papers are suitably compressed and the paper appears as one. After compressing the paper with hammer and stone, the wad is dipped into water, gently wrung out, and then beaten on a board with a narrow wooden stick. The narrow stick allows for a lot of control and a quick beating rhythm. Here you can see the beginning of this process. And this is as the pulp is beaten down more and more and spread across the board. So in total, this part of the process can take 2 to 3 hours. So I'm reminded then of another verse from the papermaking song, "Patience is money." So why did papermakers decide to add safflower to indigo and not only use safflower dyed sheets? The reason is that safflower, or benibana in Japanese, is said to fade with time, while indigo only grows deeper. Papermakers discovered that by combining indigo and safflower, a more long-lasting purple could be achieved. So here we can see faded safflower dye on tanka poetry strips, while the indigo remains vibrant. But here, in our previous example from the 13th century, we can see that there has been only partial fading to this indigo and safflower combination pulp over the last 700 years. Before I show a demo at the vat, I want to go over a few unique Uchigumo-specific tools you will see in the video. We have already discussed the hammer, stone, and narrow beating stick. I'd like to also talk about the sha, which is traditionally in Japanese papermaking a silk mesh that fits on the bamboo screen to eliminate the laid lines in the paper. For Uchigumo gami, though, the sha is made of linen. Linen is coarse, and this coarseness prevents the dyed pulp from sliding too much along the surface of the base paper. It thus gives the papermaker a bit more control when applying dyed pulp layers. For the Uchigumo I'm making in my studio, I have devised a linen sha that I coated with kakishibu, or persimmon tannin, which makes the sha slightly water resistant while retaining the porousness of the linen. The aim here is more atmospheric clouds akin to classical Uchigumo, so threads are not thick under the sha. And then as we discussed for the Iwano 20th century Uchigumo, the threads underneath the sha are quite pronounced. There is also the draining board, an item which I discovered in books as I was researching Uchigumo gami, and that dates back at least 150 years. This board has canals notched into the surface. When the bamboo screen is placed against this draining board while it is upright, water comes rushing out of the base paper and back into the vat. So the narrow notches here suck the paper from the screen and then the water trickles out. This is thus an early form of water conservation, as well as a way to quickly remove moisture from the base paper, enabling the papermaker to move to the dye vats in quick succession. Remember, the wetter that base paper is, the more difficult the dyed pulp will be to control. So my draining board is made using aspen and 45-degree canals, and here it is in use, draining into the vat. This is how the Hana vat is prepared, which holds that reconstituted indigo pulp. Note that the vat is shallow and angled. Hana vats are angled at 30 to 35 degrees so as to make it easy for the papermaker to charge the sugeta with Hana slurry. When you add Hana pulp, use outstretched fingers as a whisk to disperse the fibers as evenly as possible within the vat. Note that Hana vats do not use formation aid, which is used when making the base paper. Adding formation aid to the Hana pulp will slow its drainage, thus enabling it to slide to the end of the paper and not stop as it drains. This means little to no gradient. Thus, formation aid prevents the crafting of romantic, cloud-like designs. A degree of unpredictability and spontaneity is a virtue in Uchigumo and other associated decorative styles. Now I will show you how I make Uchigumo designs in my studio. You'll see some overlaps with the Iwano style, but I'm trying to incorporate more atmospheric designs, similar to classical Uchigumo, which we saw earlier. To do this, I am using reconstituted kozo Hana fiber on a gampi base sheet. For me, the toes are important. I've been using my feet more and more. The first shrug and sort of hop at the vat are to achieve height in the band of pulp, as well as sways in the movement of the indigo cloud horizon. The second hit of the sugeta against the end of the vat is to achieve subtle shifts in the humps, as well as to consolidate the indigo into a thicker band and create a gradient. Here you can see a sheet mimicking Heian period designs being kooched. Why? Why have I devoted so much time to studying this very specific decorative Japanese papermaking technique? And how is any of this relevant in the 21st century? Papermaking is more than the sum of its parts. I might answer, I want us to preserve heritage, learn culture, and appreciate the papermakers that came before us. But there's more to it. Within this obscure, near-dead tradition, there lie lessons that stretch across disciplines and can apply to our practice today. First, Uchigumo papermaking represents community. The painterly designs of Uchigumo and related decorative techniques, one of which, called tobigumo paper, which can be seen here, are almost contemporary in their execution and design, especially amidst renewed interest in natural dyes. This shows us that we do not practice papermaking in a vacuum, but are a link in a longer chain of people. In everything we do, there is story, lore, and learning. Second, and practically speaking, Uchigumo Gami shows us the dynamism of pulp and the possibilities of using our bodies to manipulate it with spontaneity. More than 1,000 years ago, papermakers opted to move their arms and bodies beyond the stiffness of the vat. Today, amidst careful lining up of stencils and other coloring techniques, Uchigumo presents a contrasting method and a refreshing opportunity for a contemporary comeback, not through exact replication, but through interpretations and personalized forms. Uchigumo methods are a relic of a time when movement dictated design. No mylar or plastic sheeting, no registration, just the body and a willingness to accept the movement of clouds.